A homeless veteran was on trial. When the judge heard his name, the entire courtroom stood up. He entered in handcuffs, head down, thin, covered by a worn-out coat that seemed to have weathered decades, not just seasons. His shoes were so worn that one foot touched the ground. His face bore more than wrinkles. It carried abandonment. Too frail to seem threatening, too invisible for anyone to notice. Antonio Ribeiro, 73 years old, without a fixed address, arrested for trespassing. The crime, sleeping behind a bakery on a night when temperatures dropped to -4 degrees Celsius. Among empty sacks and the smell of stale bread, he just wanted to survive the night. The courtroom was cold, almost hostile. At the back, the prosecutor hastily adjusted his tie. The public defender didn't even show up. To everyone there, it was just another case, another homeless person disturbing the peace. Nothing that required special attention. But for Judge Larissa Montenegro, it wasn't like that. Seated at the front of the room, she read the case file with eyes trained by routine. She flipped through the pages slowly until she stopped. Her gaze froze upon reading the defendant's full name, Antonio Carlos Ribeiro. She felt her body stiffen. An old memory she had kept like a scar resurfaced with sudden force. It was the name her brother repeated in handwritten letters, always accompanied by the same phrase, "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have come back." Enrique Montenegro, captain, killed in combat 19 years ago. Before he died, he spoke with admiration of a man who had saved him in the field, a stubborn, quiet, courageous sergeant. National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. She looked back at the defendant, head down, eyes lost, shoulders hunched. He was unrecognizable and at the same time unmistakable. Time had ravaged him, but it was him. Larissa swallowed hard, tried to maintain a neutral expression, but the hand holding the pen trembled. The institutional coldness of the room seemed absurd in the face of that revelation. The hero from her brother's stories, handcuffed for seeking shelter from the cold. While the prosecutor read the charges aloud indifferently, Larissa barely listened. The sound seemed distant, muffled by memories of Henrique's laughter, letters scented with sand and gunpowder, stories that always ended with gratitude for someone no one else knew. But now he was there, forgotten by everyone, except her. When the prosecutor suggested a sentence of restricted movement and community service, Antonio didn't react. He remained motionless, as if he had already accepted whatever the world decided to impose on him. Larissa, still silent, wrote something on a note, folded it, discreetly called an officer, and handed it over. The order was clear. "Take this to Attorney Eduardo Ferraz, personally." The officer left without question. In front of her, Antonio looked up for a brief second. They looked at each other. She wanted to say something, but couldn't. Not there. Not yet. The trial continued, but everything had already changed. While the court proceeded with its bureaucratic course, Larissa Montenegro seemed to be in two places at once. In the judge's chair, firm and silent, and in the past hearing her brother's voice echo in her memory. Enrique spoke of that sergeant as if he were a father. He recounted how he remained calm when everything turned to chaos, how he dragged him wounded under crossfire, how he held his hand when he thought he was going to die. "He taught me more in 3 days in the jungle than the entire academy did in 3 years, he said in one of the letters. "If I come back, I want you to meet him." But she never did. Enrique returned alive, but not for long. And now, almost 20 years later, that sergeant reappeared. Not as a hero, but as a defendant. Larissa didn't know whether to feel anger, pity, or shame, perhaps all at once. In front of her, Antonio remained motionless. When he spoke, it was low, disconnected. He said he tried to knock on the bakery's door, that he didn't want to invade anything. He just wanted a place where the cold didn't hurt so much. "I just wanted a corner to lie down, that's all." Those were the only words he said that morning. Then the courtroom door opened. A tall man entered, wearing a dark suit and a serious look. His firm voice cut through the silence. "Eduardo Ferraz, defense attorney. I assume representation of the defendant. The prosecutor barely concealed his disdain. Last-minute voluntary representation, unacceptable. Larissa intervened without hesitation. Accepted. Proceed, Mr. Ferraz. Eduardo wasn't just any lawyer. He was a well-known name, a constant presence in high-profile cases. He usually didn't appear in cases like that, but he was there for a reason only Larissa knew. Ferraz quickly flipped through the case file, asked simple questions, requested time, contested the charges. In minutes, he dismantled the prosecutor's argument based on basic principles of humanity and legality. There is no trespassing when there is no intent to possess. There is desperation, survival, and social abandonment. The prosecutor countered, speaking of repeated behavior. Eduardo replied, "What repeats here is not the crime. It's the negligence." The room fell silent. Meanwhile, Larissa kept her eyes fixed on Antonio. He remained aloof, as if he were distant. He didn't seem to recognize Eduardo, nor himself. But Ferraz was beginning to suspect. That man wasn't just an ordinary homeless person. There was something in his posture. Even weakened, there was still firmness. There was discipline buried under years of neglect. YouTube. At the end of the session, Eduardo approached Larissa in the hallway. "Now tell me, who is he really?" Larissa hesitated. "The man who saved my brother's life." Eduardo remained silent for a few seconds, then responded without looking back. "Then we're not going to let this pass as just another case." Eduardo Ferraz wasn't the type to get involved on impulse, but there was something about that man that wouldn't let him rest. In the days following the hearing, he delved into Antonio's past. He started with the basics: public records, military records, lists of commendations. But it didn't take long to notice a pattern. Too many pieces were missing. Where there should have been detailed mission reports, he found only vague summaries. Where he expected to find medical records, there were gaps. It was as if, little by little, someone had erased Antonio from official history. Stubborn, Eduardo began to dig deeper. He reached out to old contacts in the army, called in favors. Even a former client, now a retired colonel, was surprised to hear the name Antonio Ribeiro. That's a battlefield name. That man was a legend among non-commissioned officers. What do you mean he's living on the street? But no one knew where he had gone after being discharged. No one had seen him since. To the system, he had disappeared. At the custody center where Antonio was temporarily housed, Eduardo tried to earn his trust. He brought coffee, clean blankets, asked questions that received few answers. Antonio barely spoke. He would spend hours staring at the floor. When he did speak, he mixed past and present, as if he were still on the battlefield. He mentioned names Eduardo didn't recognize, and one he did: Enrique. Enrique? That boy was stubborn. His shoulder was blown out, but he wanted to run back into the gunfire. He murmured this without context one random afternoon. Eduardo observed everything carefully, patiently. One day he brought a folder, sat in front of Antonio, and took out a yellowed, faded photo of a group of soldiers in the jungle. One of them, younger, smiled slightly. He was wounded but smiling. "This one is Enrique Montenegro, isn't it?" Antonio looked and froze. Time seemed to stop. His eyes, usually empty, lit up for an instant. His trembling hand reached out and gently touched the image. His voice came out choked. "I pulled him by the vest." He was down, his leg full of shrapnel. He said he was going home, that he wanted to introduce me to his sister. Pause. He used to call me a stubborn old man. The silence that followed hurt more than any words. It was at that moment Eduardo understood. That man still carried everything: the trauma, the guilt, the unfulfilled promise. That same night, Eduardo returned to the office and reviewed every line of what he had discovered. He finally found a gap, a discreet mention of military files recently declassified under a new transparency program. He accessed the portal, submitted requests, waited 48 hours, and then came the names, the mission, the ambush. Antonio Carlos Ribeiro had operated under direct fire, saved 4 soldiers, and prevented the collapse of his unit during a forced retreat. Wounded, he refused evacuation to continue helping. He was recommended for a decoration, but the process was never finalized. It was all real. Eduardo printed the reports, highlighted excerpts, and was organizing the papers when he stopped for a moment, looking at the desk covered in documents. There was an entire man there, with a story, with honor, with scars, a man the world chose to forget. He picked up the phone. Larissa. Yes? He didn't just save your brother, he saved an entire team. And then he was abandoned. She took a while to respond. When she did, her voice was firm but lower. Bring everything. We'll show the court who he is. But more than that, we'll remind the country of what he did. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was no longer the same. The man who once looked like just another indigent now had a renowned lawyer by his side, and in front of them was a pile of documents no one expected to see. Eduardo Ferraz calmly opened his presentation. He placed not only military reports on the bench, but a timeline. He pointed out omissions, ignored names, forgotten protocols, read excerpts, highlighted dates. He showed copies of documents stamped by the army itself. According to what was now official, Antonio Ribeiro had prevented the deaths of at least 5 soldiers during an ambush abroad. He had been nominated for the National Order of Courage, but the process was shelved after his medical discharge. The room fell silent. The prosecutor, until then indifferent, adjusted the papers in front of him as if trying to reorganize his argument. But at that point, there was no argument left. Judge Larissa then authorized the calling of witnesses. The first was a tall, gray-haired man in full-dress uniform, retired General Augusto Marines. Sergeant Ribeiro saved my life. I was a lieutenant on that mission. I was hit in the shoulder in open field. He dragged me nearly 100 meters under fire. I never forgot it, but the system seems to have. 2 other former soldiers followed, each telling how they had been saved by the man who now could barely sit upright in his chair. Antonio listened in silence. He seemed unable to believe they were talking about him. Eduardo then requested a reading from the declassified report. Sergeant Ribeiro demonstrated high-risk personal conduct, remaining in a defensive position after ensuring the evacuation of 3 wounded soldiers. His voluntary stay provided time for the platoon to reorganize and prevented further casualties. The entire room listened in absolute silence. Not even the sound of shoes or pages turning could be heard. Then Larissa spoke, her voice firm, though her eyes were glassy. What we have here is not just a case file. It is the portrait of a systemic failure. A man who served with honor, forgotten due to administrative errors, and who now, ironically, sits here as a defendant when he should be receiving honors. She then made a gesture toward the door. 2 military officers entered. One of them carried a small blue box. Inside, a golden pin, the National Order of Courage, a decoration delayed by nearly 20 years. Antonio looked at it without understanding. It took him a few seconds to process. When he realized what it was, his first reaction was negative. He said quietly, "I didn't save Henrique. He died because of me." Larissa stepped forward, breaking protocol, not as a judge, but as a sister. "He lived because of you. He came home. He wrote to me. He described you as the bravest man he had ever met. He asked me to find you." Antonio didn't respond. He just cried. And in that room that once only saw him as an intruder, everyone stood, the prosecutor, the court staff, the soldiers, the spectators watching the hearing. No one said a word. No one needed to. The judge took a deep breath. The charges are dismissed, and the state must urgently begin the process of reinstating all legal rights and benefits. Eduardo nodded. Antonio lowered his head, but this time not out of shame. It was relief. The following week, what was supposed to be a mere administrative formality turned into a moment of historical reparation. Antonio was called back to court, but this time not as a defendant, rather as an honoree. The room wasn't as crowded as before, no curious audience or hurried journalists. It was a more restrained, more intimate setting. Eduardo stood by his side, as did two officers of the National Army, now dressed in ceremonial uniforms. And Larissa, despite her position, could no longer hide what she felt. She was not just a judge. She was Enrique's sister. She was someone who carried the same debt the country owed that man. Antonio entered wearing new clothes. A simple but clean suit, a shaved beard, his body still bent, but changed, not from age, but from the weight of the past, a weight that was finally beginning to lift. He was called to the center of the room. One of the officers read in a firm voice, "For proven bravery in combat, conduct of high personal risk, and direct contribution to the survival of members of the armed forces, the National Army honors Sub-Lieutenant Antonio Carlos Ribeiro with the National Order of Courage." The blue box was opened, and the medal sparkled under the room's light. But Antonio didn't move. He looked at the decoration like someone seeing a shattered mirror, took a deep breath and spoke in a broken voice. "I don't deserve this." "He died." Silence was immediate. Eduardo approached, placed a hand on his shoulder. "But he lived long enough to come back, to write, to say thank you, and to tell a sister that you were the reason he still had hope." Larissa stood up and stepped down from the bench. "Death does not erase what was saved, Sub-Lieutenant. You gave my brother time and gave our family more than words can explain." Antonio squinted. A sob escaped. He still held guilt, like someone clutching an old rifle. "I just did what anyone would do," he said, almost in a whisper. The officer handed him the medal. Antonio held it with both hands, unsure whether to wear it or simply look at it. Finally, he closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against it. "Thank you," he said with difficulty, "for not forgetting me completely." The next gesture didn't come from Larissa or the military. It came from the prosecutor. He stood up, straightened his posture, and saluted. The entire room followed, not out of protocol, but out of respect. That afternoon, the government officially granted Sub-Lieutenant Antonio Ribeiro a lifetime pension, assisted housing, and full medical care. The case was sent to the Ministry of Defense as a symbol of failure and reparation, and the press, always arriving too late, now wanted headlines, interviews, attention. But Antonio refused. He only wanted silence and a place where he could finally sleep in peace. It was small, a bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen with a table and 2 chairs, but it was his. After so long sleeping on cardboard, under awnings, on park benches, that quiet apartment felt like a castle. There was no luxury, but there was warmth. The walls had no mold, the bed had clean sheets, the shower worked. Antonio spent his days in silence. He made coffee every morning like performing a ritual. He watched the water boil, waited for the foam to rise, filled the cup carefully, as if it were the most important moment of the day. And it was. The TV stayed off, the windows open. He liked the sound of the street, horns, footsteps, random voices. It was proof he was part of the world again. He received visits from time to time, nurses, social workers, soldiers who came to check documents, but he only smiled genuinely when Eduardo came by. He always arrived unannounced, bringing bread, fruit, city news, chatting a bit. But when Eduardo sat down, Antonio relaxed. For the first time in many years, there was someone with whom he didn't need to defend himself. "Everything okay now, Mr. Antonio?" the lawyer would ask. He would shrug. "I'm trying to learn how to be at peace." "It's harder than it seems." Sleeping was still complicated. Sometimes he'd wake up sweating, hearing shots that no longer existed. On other nights, he'd cry without sound, hugging a blanket. But now, there was something different. He knew he could close his eyes again, and that made all the difference. On a Friday afternoon, the intercom rang. It was Larissa. Antonio hesitated. He hadn't expected that visit. He thought of refusing out of shame, but something inside told him He should see her. He opened the door. She stood there with a folder in her hand and a soft expression. "May I come in?" He nodded without a word. They sat at the kitchen table. For a few seconds, the only sound was the kettle on. The stove. Larissa placed the folder on the table and pushed it toward him. "These are letters from my brother. They were stored at my mother's house. Some I'd never read." Antonio touched the envelope like it was glass. He opened it slowly, took out a carefully folded letter, and recognized the handwriting. "Sergeant Ribeiro saved me. Not just my body, but my mind. He taught me how to stay calm, not to panic. He taught me what courage is. If I ever return, I want you to meet this man. He doesn't speak much, but he says everything through what he does." Antonio read in silence. Then another, and another. Some spoke of the battlefield, others of fear, but all ended with gratitude. He took a deep breath and murmured, "For so long, I thought no one remembered." Larissa, eyes full of tears, replied, "The world may forget, but those who were saved never do." That night, Antonio slept without nightmares. For the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. Antonio was getting used to his new routine. The silence of the apartment was different from the silence of the streets. Here, it didn't hurt. Here, he could close his eyes without fear of being kicked, woken, driven away. He drank coffee slowly, straightened crooked pictures on the wall, swept the floor even when clean. He was starting to understand what it meant to have a place. On a random afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Larissa. She brought a brown envelope, but this time it wasn't meant to be opened there. She only said, "This is for when you're ready, but most importantly, Antonio, you made it back." He nodded, didn't respond. He didn't need to. When she left, he didn't open the letter. He placed the envelope on the table and sat by the window. Down below, children ran in the square. There was sun, a light breeze, a strange sense of peace. He didn't recognize, but didn't reject either. He stayed there for minutes, maybe hours, until he spoke, as if speaking to absence. "For so long, I thought no one remembered." And for the first time, it didn't sound like a lament. It sounded like a realization. But at that moment, someone across the square, a boy in a military school uniform, ran by, stopped, looked up and waved. A simple gesture, without knowing who the old man at the window was. Antonio replied with a slight wave. He smiled, small, discreet, but genuine. If this story reminded you that no one should be forgotten, tap the like button and leave just one thing in the comments: "I remember." Sometimes that's all it takes to honor those who deserve it.